Our favorite humans, welcome to Bronx Tales with your host, Bronxy B, and me, I'm Logan. Thank you for being here. In my last episode, I was called out respectfully, and I appreciate that, but I was called out on a statement that I made regarding Steve G. Now, I said that I couldn't understand why he would want such specific details regarding his daughter's death. And several people commented and said, as a parent, if their child was unalived in this horrific way, they would want to know the details as well. And I couldn't help but understand exactly where they were coming from and completely changing my mind on that fact, because it also made me think that we know Steve G has made a couple of posts and basically asking for truth, which to me insinuates he feels like he may not have the truth still. I'm not putting words in his mouth. That's just my opinion on what I got when I read it. So it makes me think, does Steve G maybe want some of these details or all of these details because he doesn't trust anymore what the state has provided him with all their compelling or lack thereof evidence, and maybe he thinks he was lied to by the state and prosecution, and that there's more to this crime, whether it be somebody else or a different perpetrator or another perpetrator or anything else. So I just want to thank those who respectfully called me out and making me see how Steve G might want the details and the reasons why, and maybe some other things behind it, where he is asking for the truth because he feels like he doesn't have it. Same with us. We don't have the truth. I want to talk about this letter from Bicca Barlow briefly. Many people think that this is real, and I would bet my last penny in my life that this is not real. There are entirely way too many punctuation errors and spelling errors for this letter to have come from a PhD student and a lawyer. Never have I ever seen a lawyer put out a statement on behalf of somebody else, a defendant, and it had so many spelling errors. And I noticed that immediately. I was like, that's not how you spell those words. So to me, I believe this letter is 1,000% false. No way would a lawyer ever put out a statement with so many misspelled words within a very small paragraph. So I just wanted to say real quick, please don't believe the hype. This is not real. So I watched the Peacock documentary of the Idaho student murders. And really on that one, there was nothing to call home about. There wasn't any different information that we don't already have. They kind of just reiterated the stuff from Dateline. They did have a couple points in there that would maybe make you question if Bryan Kohberger was the real perpetrator. They did have a view from a defense attorney that was kind of backing the defense on a couple of things. Still nothing super important. But one thing that did catch my attention was at the end, they asked Steve G. Jr., Kaylee's brother, something along the lines of a plea deal, which I thought was kind of strange because you have to keep in mind the production of this documentary was weeks and weeks and months ago. At the time of this production of this documentary, they didn't have any idea of a plea deal. There was no plea deal in sight. At the time of this production, it was 1,000% we're going to trial. That's where we were at in that case. So I found it really interesting that they asked Steve G. Jr. a question about a plea deal. I feel like they could have asked him a bajillion other questions, and they asked him about his feelings on if there was a plea deal, which was a little odd. And within this documentary, Steve G. Jr. also made a comment that sat funny with me. It was along the lines of, making sure the correct perpetrator is in jail. And it just gave me pause, thinking that maybe there might be just a smidge of doubt in his mind. And again, I'm not putting words in his mouth. It's just the way the question was asked and answered that gave me pause, making me think that he might have just an iota of a doubt in the back of his mind on if Bryan Kohberger is the actual perpetrator or is the lone perpetrator. Now, as much as so many people are probably going to absolutely hate the fact that I say this, but I do want people to keep in the back of their mind, if nothing else, that at the end of the day, Bryan Kohberger's parents, aunts, uncles, sisters, they essentially have probably gone through stages of grief as well. It doesn't take away from the grief and pain that the victims' families feel, but I can't help but feel compassion for everybody and empathy for everybody. They didn't choose for this to happen. They also are going through a grieving period. Their family dynamic has also changed. And yes, I know before you say it, they can call their son in prison. They can have visits with their son. Their son is still breathing and walking this earth. Yes, I get that. But they, of all people, didn't choose for any of this. This, I think, was brought onto them completely blind. And they didn't know anything about it. And that's how I genuinely feel. So I do think we need to keep in mind that they too, in a sense, lost their son or brother. And I do think that instead of sending hate messages to them, I think that some people can learn to say nothing or try and give some people a little bit of grace. Because Kohberger's parents didn't choose for any of this. And in a sense, they lost their child as well as they knew him. There have been a lot of people that have said that they believe maybe Bryan Kohberger suddenly took a plea deal so his family didn't have to get up on the stand and testify, and to save his family from, going through all of that and being grilled on the stand. And although it could be true, absolutely, I keep thinking, though, Bryan Kohberger knew that the past 2.5 years that he's been inside, he knew that that was going to be a possibility or definitely something that would happen. So why suddenly would he get cold feet and want to save his parents from testifying? He knew that was going to happen this whole time that they were preparing for trial. So I don't necessarily think that that is why he pled guilty or asked for a plea deal, which is also then why I think that something bigger has happened or is going on, that maybe a bigger threat has happened. And that's why he was running super fast to a plea deal suddenly. It was so sudden. But no, I don't necessarily think it was the reason was fully to save his parents or family from having to testify at trial. I don't necessarily think that's the case. Now, Bill Thompson stood up to read off a paper that had all of this compelling evidence to the court. And I couldn't help but notice a couple of things. If you notice, when he was repeating some of this compelling evidence, sometimes he would say, "We believe it happened this way," or "this happened." And sometimes he would say, "It will show," or "the evidence is." But there are some times before he announces some of the evidence that he will say, "We believe it shows."
The state believes that its evidence would then show.
And I just want to make sure that people catch that. He does throw it in there pretty gracefully, but there are certain times he uses that language, which is, "We believe it shows it. It might not show it, but we believe that this is what it will tell you." Just insinuating that that's what happened, not that it was actual factual of what happened. What also caught my attention was at this time of Bill Thompson standing up and reading off the evidence, he could have taken that time to paint Brian Koberger in the absolute most disgusting light ever. And instead, he chose to almost give words of defense. He, aside from specifically pointing out that he wants to make it very clear that this was not a sexually motivated or a sexual attack on anybody in that house, but he also said things like, Brian Koberger's phone pinged off this tower. Now we want to acknowledge that this is a densely populated area, basically meaning Brian Koberger could have been pinging off this tower, not necessarily for the 1122 King Road house, but to visit a friend or get coffee or anything. I feel like Bill Thompson took that time to almost dull down the evidence that they have, although still horribly weak case. But the little bit of evidence they did have, I felt like he took the time to dull it down rather than beef it up and make him look like this horrendous monster. Bill Thompson chose to do the opposite. I thought it was a little strange.
Now, I will acknowledge for the court and all present that there are many residences in that area. It's a dense population of mostly college-related occupants. Between July 9th of 2022 and November 7th, the defendant's phone connected to that particular tower during late night, early morning hours, 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., on approximately 23 times. Now, I will acknowledge also we do not have evidence that the defendant had direct contact with 1122 or with residents of 1122, but we can put his phone in that area on those times.
He wanted to make it clear that Brian Koberger did not ever have direct contact with the 1122 King Road house or its occupants before the homicides. Now, he didn't have to state those things, and he could have said terrible things about Brian Koberger. Aside from not going to the death penalty and having the families uberly upset about that, I found it interesting that Bill Thompson also took the time to not paint Brian Koberger in a terrible light when he definitely could have, and he chose not to. And I'm curious, when he said these things, how much did it piss off the families of the victims? He specifically said, I want to make this clear so there's no speculation. Well, how come you didn't make it clear so there was no speculation on other facts of this case? You know, we still, to this day, don't know if the knife and sheath and sharpener that Brian Koberger bought on Amazon was the same sheath that was found at the crime scene. They have never connected the two. Obviously, they know what knife and sheath and sharpener was purchased on Amazon, if it had the USMC stamp on it or not, and they have never connected those two and said it was the exact same that was purchased. It only says that Brian Koberger did purchase a K-bar, a sheath, and a sharpener. It does not say that it was the same that was found at the scene. And Bill Thompson could have taken that time to address things like that, and he chose not to. I'm so intrigued to see the body language at the sentencing, to see if it was anything like it was at the plea hearing. Interestingly enough, at the end of the plea hearing, the defense seemed to look confident and pleased and like they have a plan. And I couldn't help but notice that the state prosecution seemed to look defeated and slouched and not confident at all. So I'm very curious to see if that body language trickles over into the sentencing or if there's a change in body language from either side. Some of the reason that I'm still looking into this case and I can't give it up is because I think, like most of you guys, we feel a sense of almost like we've been manipulated. the state said over and over how they have such compelling evidence. They even got Steve G to say that they have compelling evidence. And I think even now he's starting to realize that they didn't. They really didn't have very compelling evidence. And I think we all feel a sense of manipulation. We had our emotions involved in this as well. And to end with complete injustice doesn't sit right with me. And I'm sure it doesn't sit right with you guys either. And that's why I still have a need to dig into this case. But yeah, I think we all feel a sense of manipulation and like they thought they were going to bring not only the families justice and a sense of closure with a plea deal, but the general public who's interested in this case as well. And they did the exact opposite. Now both sides are pissed. Both the guilters and the pro-burgers. Everybody's pissed now because nobody got answers, and we have invested so much emotion into this case, both for the victims and for ourselves to find the truth. And we didn't get anything of the sort, and it just ended with no explanation. And us, like all of you, are hoping that at sentencing we do get more details. I'm curious to see if the questionnaire that Bryan Kohberger filled out is put in with the court documents. I think it should be, but I'm curious when this gag is lifted if that will be part of the court documents. I'm also curious to see how many of these court documents are altered or removed before the gag is lifted so we can't see them at all because, like I said, we've been manipulated. One more thing I want to touch on before I go for the night. What happened to the knife that Hunter Johnson walked into the house and picked up and carried around with him when he felt unsafe entering the home? From the standpoint of the police, you walk into a home, there's 4 victims that are deceased from sharp force. And you have a man standing there with a knife in his hand. And at no point did you consider him a suspect. At no point did you take that knife and test it. Why? What happened to the knife that Hunter Johnson was carrying? Now, I'm not putting any blame on Hunter Johnson. I don't think he did anything wrong. But wouldn't you find that odd? Don't you find that odd? That the police get a call, they walk into a home, there's 4 deceased people from sharp force, and there is a college kid standing there with a knife in his hand. And you didn't think to look into that, to take the knife, to test it, anything? That right there from day one is what gives me pause. What happened to the knife that Hunter Johnson had? And while I'm on that topic, wouldn't you think it would make more sense to test the blood on the handrail and find out whose DNA that is? Considering that is a non-removable object. That is a stationary object that stays in that house and can never be removed. I understand why you took the sheath. I understand why you tested it. But that is a removable object. That is an object that could be planted. I'm not insinuating that it was. I'm just saying it could be. So wouldn't you want to, just in good faith, test something like blood that was on the first floor handrail, considering that can't be a planted object, that isn't a removable object, that's stationary to the home? Wouldn't it make more sense to test that as well? And I can't figure out why they find it so unimportant. Or is it fear of finding out the real answer, that maybe it wouldn't have belonged to Bryan Kohberger, and that would mean that they were wrong, and they don't want to admit that, and they don't want it to prove that. And that's the only reason I can think that they wouldn't test all of these other DNA samples that they have and compare them against other people. because I believe that that would show an even bigger story and more than likely prove them wrong. Now, before I leave, I want to leave you with this. Just think on this for a minute. I don't have an answer. I just find this a huge coincidence, and I don't believe in coincidences. So the state says that Brian Kohlberger's phone turned off at 2:54 a.m. You know who else went dark at that exact same minute on their phones? Kaylee and Maddie. What are the odds that both Brian Kohlberger and Kaylee and Maddie's phones all went dark at the exact same time? And that's not even the time of the crime, they say. At the exact same minute. And that's not even the time the crime happened, they say. What are the odds of that? That's such a coincidence. So that's what we wanted to talk to you about today. Your host went to bed. Do something nice for yourself today. Be kind, but more importantly, be kind to your dog. Bye, guys.